Good morning, all of you joining us from the West Coast. Good midday or afternoon from those tuning in further east. I'd like to warmly welcome you to the first CRL program of the academic year. My name is Jen Jenkins. I am CRL's Communications and Membership Coordinator, and it is my honor and a privilege to introduce our speaker for today. Cailin O'Connor is a philosopher of science and applied mathematician specializing in models of social interaction. She is a Chancellor's Professor of Logic and Philosophy of Science at the University of California, Irvine. Cailin has written 4 books and published widely in both philosophy and the social sciences. Her book, The Misinformation Age, co-authored with James Owen Weatherall, was published in 2019 with Yale University Press and considers how false beliefs spread in human social networks. In her book, The Origins of Unfairness, also published in 2019 with Oxford University Press, this title looks at how human groups culturally evolve unfair rules. Her work has been praised widely, including in the New York Times and Scientific American, and Cailin regularly appears on podcasts and radio to talk about misinformation, democracy, and fairness. So without further ado, I will cede the podium to Professor Cailin O'Connor. Thanks, Cailin.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. I'm really delighted to be here to speak to this group. And given the topic, curation as misinformation, I'm really keen to hear how some of the folks in this audience think about curation and its impacts on public belief. So I will just get started with a little kind of motivating example here. We'll return to this later in the talk. So over the last few decades, the Coca-Cola company has extensively funded and communicated about exercise science, and particularly the link between exercise and good health outcomes, like the reduction of diseases like diabetes. And they've also done a lot of work to emphasize what people sometimes call the energy balance message, which is that weight gain and loss is about a balance between energy taken in and energy put out. So subsequent to all of this funding and effort on the part of Coke, a number of scientists and journalists have become worried about Coca-Cola's influence on science and on public health beliefs. So in 2017, the Union of Concerned Scientists even published a report raising worries about this campaign. Notably, though, none of the critics of Coke have made accusations of fraud, of questionable research practices, of influence on the research, or of lying or sharing inaccurate information. So the worry seems to be that Coke is funding and sharing this research on exercise, even though the research itself seems fine, which raises, I think, a kind of interesting and important question. What's wrong with this? Why shouldn't Coke fund and share independent, seemingly good research on exercise? So we're going to try to answer this question in part by the end of this talk. And as we'll see, this is going to be one example out of many of how something that we're calling curation here, curation writ broadly, can harm public belief. And what I'm ultimately going to argue is for a number of things. So first, the distribution of information we receive, which facts, which events, which studies deeply shape our beliefs. Second, for that reason, true or highly accurate information can be highly misleading. Third, industry, political groups, and other cynical actors can use this fact to their benefit. Fourth, even well-meaning individuals sometimes curate information that harms belief unintentionally. And then last, I'm going to argue that curation should be much more at the center of information policy, especially at a time like now where information policy is front and center because of the effects of social media on public belief. All right, so before I really dive into some of these topics, I want to give a little background on this work. So as Jen mentioned, about 5 years ago, I published this book, The Misinformation Age, with Jim Weatherall, who you can see has a great mustache. He's also my husband. And in that book, we tried to understand the way social factors led people to believe false things, and especially how false beliefs might spread in human social networks. And then in developing that project, we've written a number of follow-on papers, and I've written papers with other co-authors, thinking more generally about why human belief fails. And then this is the sort of large project that I'm drawing from in this talk. Throughout all this work, we used a particular kind of methodology, which is a combination of looking at historical case studies and then building mathematical models to try to understand these factors that lead to false beliefs. And by mathematical models, what I mean here is that we use computer simulations to create representations of real groups of human learners or representations of real social networks or real individual learners, and then use these to investigate how people form false beliefs. So in this talk, I'm not going to go into a lot of details about how that modeling works. I'll stick more to describing results. But of course, if you're curious, you can ask about it, or you can go read some papers. All right. So here's what I'll do in the rest of the talk. So first, I'll give a little quick background about what we're even talking about. What do we mean by misinformation? What do we mean by curation? And then I'll walk through 3 subtopics where curation shapes and ultimately harms belief. One looking at journalism, one looking at what we'll call industrial cherry picking, and another looking at what we'll call industrial distraction before drawing some big picture takeaways. All right, so misinformation and curation. What are we even talking about here? So let's start with misinformation. What does it mean for something to be misinformation? So this is something that people have been talking a lot about in the social sciences and in philosophy, especially since 2016. So sometimes you get this distinction between misinformation and disinformation, where the first is content that misleads, but unintentionally, and then the second is intentionally misleading content. But that distinction can get kind of muddy, especially when you look at things like online content, where often something that starts as disinformation becomes misinformation. So someone tries to start a false rumor, but other people believe it and then they share it, genuinely trying to inform other people. And then the opposite can happen. A genuine rumor could start, and then cynical actors can start using that to misinform people. So throughout this, I'm going to mostly collapse these ideas. And when I talk about misinformation, it's not going to matter whether it's accidental or it's purposeful. Now, another thing a lot of people have done, philosophers and some others, is tried to define misinformation as false or inaccurate content, which makes sense until we start to look closer at how actual misleading content works, because the form and content of misinformation is extremely variable and ever-changing. So sometimes this content is just a picture or a video or a funny meme. Sometimes it involves emotional statements that don't actually have false claims in it. Sometimes it's literally a coloring book with pictures of a jacked up Bernie Sanders. And that's a real example if you want to ask about it later. So it's often not even the kind of thing that can be false or true. And then furthermore, it's increasingly recognized that accurate and true content can be misleading, which is, of course, one of the big themes for today. So here, when I'm talking about misinformation, the picture we're going to be working with is a really broad one. A lot of things should count as misinformation, and in general, what we're interested in is whatever content tends to mislead people to get them to do things that aren't in their best interest or to believe things that are harmful for them. Now, in talking about curation, here too, I'm going to be talking about something really general. So I'm not just thinking about, a smart person with a master's degree pulling out the best pieces from the New York Times over the last year. Instead, I'm thinking about a whole series of processes that determine what information tends to reach people and what information doesn't. So on this wider picture, if we ask, what do curators look like? There's curators all around us. We have things like textbook writers and journalists, people who are actively curating misinformation. We have people online like influencers. We have active propagandists, which will be one of the things I'll talk a lot about today. We have people like librarians. We have social media algorithms as curators. We have science journals with editors and things like the Google search algorithm. And so notice that on this picture, curation is not a bad thing or a good thing. It's something that's crucial to our functioning because we can't take in or focus on all the information out there. We need to know what out of all the science there is, all the events happening, all the news is relevant or interesting to us. We need curation, but as I'm going to argue, it often can be misleading, and that's something we need to think about more. Okay, so let's talk about journalistic selection and curation in journalism, and I'll start with a few little examples here. Woman's entire family dies after she hides positive COVID test. So this is a Newsweek article from 2011. And if you were online a lot during the pandemic, as I unfortunately was, you may have seen a number of articles like this. So this is, of course, a pretty rare event. It was not common for entire families to die of COVID or even multiple people in the same family, but it was something that happened. It was real. And because it was interesting, it was something that made national headlines multiple times when similar events happened. Okay, here is another news article from a year and a half ago. From not a year and a half ago, from a few years ago. 2019 polar vortex brought record-breaking deadly cold to the area. So we see news about the weather all the time, but as I'm sure you're aware, we don't see news about all the weather because that would be extremely boring. Instead, we usually see news when the weather does something unusual or exciting, like a polar vortex or Hurricane Helene followed by Hurricane Milton the next week. And here's one last example, this time from a realm I'm particularly interested in, which is science journalism. This was again a pandemic era example. New data suggests the coronavirus isn't as deadly as we thought. So this was an article about a study out of Stanford that found an anomalously low death rate for COVID, and their results were splashed across national and international news. So even at the time this was published, there had already been a number of other studies that showed higher death rates, but the articles reporting on this one tended to just talk about this study alone and its surprisingly low finding for the COVID death rate, which was an extreme out of the studies that had been produced at that moment. All right, what's going on with these cases and why are they interesting to us? So journalists are curating information all the time and in all sorts of ways. They only report about some things. And in particular, in curating, journalists often respond to systematic incentives and to norms and ethical codes that apply to them. So one of the main incentives facing journalists are these incentives to produce grippy or exciting content. And those have always been there in journalism. But in an online world, there's even greater pressure to write stories that are clickbait, that are going to draw readers in. And that means exciting stuff. Now, journalists are also constrained by norms to report true things. And most, usually, don't just make up exciting stories for that reason. But it is typically acceptable to report on only the most exciting or extreme events. And these events tend to draw readers because they're novel and surprising. And one thing humans love is things that are novel and surprising. And of course, that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is, after all, kind of the definition of something being newsworthy, that it's different or exciting or surprising. It isn't news that my husband drank coffee for breakfast this morning. But when we look at all those examples we just talked about, what we see is people reporting on real events that occurred but that were extreme in ways that if people are only seeing those events, it might distort their picture of the underlying reality. So thinking about these kind of cases, what we did in this paper, it's called the best paper you'll see today, Media Biases and the Public Understanding of Science, was tried to ask, well, what is this kind of curation going to do to the beliefs of readers? So what happens when a smart, savvy learner sees news that's shifted towards these extremes? So what we did was we built a model, and we started by saying, okay, the world is normal. We have some distribution of events that's occurring, and it looks like what these distributions often look like, which is a normal distribution. And this could represent a lot of things. So it could represent the severity of fire seasons year to year. It could represent COVID IFR estimates, so fatality rate estimates across a number of studies. It could represent, sorry, this doesn't want to go forward. There we go. Temperature fluctuations in different cities around the world. It could represent estimates of vaccine side effect prevalence. How bad are the side effects of vaccines? And we said, well, what if we modeled journalists who are reporting real events that are happening in this distribution, but they're just reporting the extreme ones, which would look something like this. So the middle of this distribution is now gone, and the events curated for the public are the ones that are sort of extreme in either direction. And you'll notice we cut out a middle chunk, and we don't necessarily assume that that's going to be right in the middle of reality, because what people count as extreme responds to what people think is extreme, and that may or may not match reality. Feel free to ask about that if you're curious. So now people are seeing a lot of articles about, say, super mild fire seasons or really extreme fire seasons, but they're not seeing a lot of articles when the fire season is about what you'd expect. So what does this do to viewers? First, unsurprisingly, it makes the world seem extreme to them. It distorts their events by making them think extreme events are more common than they actually are. The world is more variable. The truth is more diffuse. People think sometimes COVID is killing whole families more than it actually does, but also that estimates of the fatality rate are all over the place. Sometimes they're very low, sometimes they're high. They also think, well, we're seeing extreme temperature fluctuations. Sometimes the temperatures are very, very high and very, very low, but they're not seeing that middle part of the picture. Another thing we find in these models is something a little more subtle. So one thing we know about people is that they tend to pay more attention to information that fits with what they already believe. And what that means is when we have extreme evidence in our models, this can drive polarization. So suppose someone is learning from this kind of extreme reported information and that they're already kind of a climate change denier. So they already have beliefs that average temperatures are about what they used to be historically. Well, because of the way people learn, they're then going to pay a lot of attention to the evidence that fits with what they already believe, but not very much attention to the extreme evidence that doesn't fit what they believe. And learners in our models, as a result, tend to double down on their viewpoint. They just get stronger beliefs that the thing they already thought is true. And we'd see the same thing with someone who's a climate change believer. They're going to tend to pay attention to that reporting that fits with what they believe and ignore reporting that doesn't. And once again, double down on their current position. So what extremity does in cases like this is it allows two viewers to hold fast to polarized positions where a more representative distribution of reporting would pull them both towards the middle of events. And then one last thing relevant to this kind of reporting, which we don't model, but is a real world worry based on how people's minds work, is that when you see a lot of contradicting extreme reports, it can be quite confusing. So here's an example. Science journalists often report on single studies, and they often report on the studies that are the most extreme or surprising. So one thing you might see online are things like this: want a healthier heart, seriously consider skipping the drinks, versus a glass of red wine is the equivalent to an hour at the gym, says new study. So studies finding red wine's good for you, red wine's bad for you, red wine's good for you, red wine's bad for you. red wine's bad for you. But if you're seeing this kind of whiplash reporting, what people do is get frustrated, confused, even mistrustful, and often give up on trying to understand the truth about some area. One thing worth noticing here is I'm talking about science reporting and reporting more generally, where you have a person who's the curator, but you can see the same kind of effect sometimes happening with social media algorithms. So these algorithms tend to select extreme content because it's novel and surprising, and people like that. And so content that's further towards the extremes tends to get promoted. And again, you may see these kinds of effects that we're talking about as a result. All right, so that's one kind of way that journalists end up curating information. I'm going to talk about one other way we see curation in journalism before moving on to talk about industry. So, journalists traditionally have followed an ethical code that requires fairness or balance on controversial issues. And what this has often involved is curating or selecting information to give equal weight to two sides of an issue. So, if we have an expert on one side of an issue present, we allow an expert on the other side of an issue. Or if we give this much print space to one part of an issue, we give equal print space to the other side. But especially when we're talking about science journalism or journalism reporting about real events and evidence in the world, there's a big worry about fairness, which is called a false balance worry. And the idea is that, especially when you're looking at scientific cases, usually one side of a controversy is going to have less evidence in support of it. And so treating two sides completely equally is going to be artificially propping up the side with less evidence. And climate change is a completely classic case of this. So here's an article from 2013 worrying about false balance on Fox News, where at the time when Fox News was reporting about climate change, they were typically giving equal weight to two sides of this controversy, someone who thinks it's real, someone who thinks it isn't real. And that's in spite of an overwhelming consensus by experts that climate change was indeed happening at the time, and an overwhelming weight of evidence in favor of climate change. And since then, there's been a lot of attention to climate reporting and false balance, but we still see false balance in many other cases. So we wanted to model how this kind of reporting might impact beliefs. And so in this paper, How to Beat Science and Influence People, Policymakers, and Propaganda in Epistemic Networks, that's what we did. So Jim Weatherall, Justin Bruner, who is a philosopher at University of Buffalo, and I built a model where we simulated a network of scientists. So what we mean here is individuals who are gathering some evidence about a problem. Is climate change happening? And their evidence usually points them in the right direction, like scientific evidence usually does, but sometimes can point them in the wrong direction because, of course, scientific evidence is probabilistic. And then what we simulated was a journalist who would report on this evidence to members of the public or policymakers. And we looked at two different variations of the model. So in the first variation, the journalist would share all the information coming from the scientists with policymakers. And in the second, what they would do is report fairly, which meant for every time they reported something showing evidence in favor of climate change, they would also report one study showing evidence against it. And what we found was that, somewhat paradoxically, fair reporting in these scientific cases would lead to dependably worse beliefs. And that would happen for the same reason I just described, because the journalist here would be systematically overweighting evidence for the worst belief. So across this community, you'd see more evidence in support of the better belief. So when the journalist is always giving one piece on each side, they're propping up the false belief. And what we argue in that paper is that a better strategy would involve surveying and reporting on the entire body of evidence in a literature, maybe in summary form. So here are a few takeaways. Journalists, because of incentives, because of norms, are curating information all the time, and the way they do that is expected to shape people's beliefs about how the world looks. Extreme reporting can lead to extreme beliefs. It may also drive polarization, and sometimes it can lead to confusion and frustration. Fairness in cases of false balance can harm belief. And if we want to talk about good practices here, that would involve doing less curation and more context giving. So overviewing what's the weight of evidence in any particular case. What's the context that allows people to best understand a piece of evidence? So stuff that's less like woman's whole family died of COVID, more like sometimes COVID is very deadly. In general, it's about this deadly. All right. So with that, let's talk about industrial cherry picking. And another little story. So in the early 1950s, it was starting to become clear that cigarettes were killing their users. And some prominent studies and widespread reporting on this led to the first declines in tobacco sales in decades. And in response, the big tobacco panicked. So 6 major US tobacco firms hired a public relations company out of New York to fight this growing consensus that their product was killing users. And what they decided to do was something fairly new, which was that they would fight science with science. So in their book, Merchants of Doubt, the historians of science, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, document these strategies, and they call them the tobacco strategy. So this involved many different parts. But one thing they did right then in the 1950s was formed a group called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. So this was ostensibly a research group. We just want to know, is tobacco safe or is it dangerous? But in fact, it was a propaganda body. And one thing this group did was produce and distribute pamphlets that would say things like, 9 studies find no link between tobacco and cancer. And that would be true. They would be drawing on 9 actual real independent studies that had failed to find any link between tobacco and cancer. But what they would be failing to do is mentioning the 50 other studies that did. So we can call this industrial cherry picking. What is this? It involves taking real independent studies that happen to support industry views and then sharing just those studies widely. And when industry does this, it takes advantage of the probabilistic nature of science. So not everyone who smokes gets cancer, and not everyone who gets cancer was a smoker. And what that is going to mean is that some studies will not find a link between tobacco and cancer, even though an underlying link is there, and then industry can take advantage of this. So we again wanted to study this strategy. So we again built a model where we simulated scientists testing the world, but this time we assumed that policymakers or the public could see some of this evidence from science. And maybe some of these individuals read a lot of scientific studies, others fewer, and others very few. And we asked, well, what would these policymakers come to believe on the basis of this evidence that they're seeing? But importantly, we also simulated one more agent in this model, which is a propagandist or an individual who would look at the scientific data being produced and curate it, sharing just the misleading studies with policymakers. So just the studies that happen to spuriously show tobacco is safe or whatever industry wants to show. And what we found is that in the model with no propagandist, all these observers would eventually believe what the scientists would come to believe. So they'd be seeing some unbiased set of evidence, which over time would tend to push them towards the truth. Tobacco is dangerous. When we added the propagandist into the model, this process would always slow down and in many cases reverse. So in other words, the curation of this real independently produced data could completely mislead the public in our model. And notably, we're modeling these agents of the public as ideal learners. They learn in a fully rational way from the evidence they're produced. The evidence produced in the scientific community is produced in an ideal way. It's just the presence of this cherry picking that leads them astray. We did find in our model this would be harder to do when the scientists were running studies with large sample sizes, or what we can think of as high quality studies, because in these cases, there would be fewer findings for this propagandist to weaponize. So in this kind of regime where industry is trying to shape public belief by curation, every misleading study turns into a weapon in their hands. And when there are fewer studies like that, there's less that they can do to mislead the public. So kind of slightly weird takeaway here, just because a scientific finding is real, gathered by real scientists using ideal methods, doesn't mean it isn't misinformation related to the larger theme of this talk. The context in which something is shared is going to determine whether or not it ends up being misleading. All right, with that, let's move on to talk about our last topic, industrial distraction. So this is again an industrial propaganda strategy, but one that works a little different than cherry picking. So this is a strategy that reworks the public's causal understanding of the world by sharing accurate but distracting information to industry benefit. So remember the Coca-Cola example that I started with, where Coca-Cola was funding and sharing all this work on exercise and its benefits, and then scientists and journalists were getting worried about that. The reason they were worried is that all of that work was basically a causal distraction. It's not that the science was bad. It was real science as far as anyone can tell, good science done by real scientists, and on, frankly, a topic of public importance. But the aim with which it was funded and then shared was to distract from the harms of Coca-Cola and other sugar-sweetened beverages. So in this paper, Industrial Distraction, David Freeborn, who's a philosopher and modeler at Northeast London, and I got interested in this kind of technique. And we wanted to ask, how does this mislead? So what we did is built what are called causal Bayesian networks. And don't worry, you can just forget that term if you like. But these would be models of how ideal or rational individuals would learn about the causal structure of the world that could help us understand how this strategy might mislead people. And what we did is considered a few variations of different types of industrial distraction and asked, how does this kind of curation mislead, even for good learners? So this is what one of these causal graphs look like. And it's a representation of how someone might think about the world and its causal structure. And each of these nodes here is tracking some kind of event or something that happens in the world. And then the arrows represent people's beliefs about how they're related. So in the Coke case, here's how people might think the world works. Drinking Coke tends to cause diet-related diseases. On the basis of this kind of link, you might think, well, maybe I should drink less Coke. But based on information shared from Coke, you might also think, well, there's another cause of diet-related diseases, which is sedentary lifestyle. And what we show in our models is that if people start off thinking the Coke to diet-related disease link is pretty strong, but then see a lot of evidence showing that sedentary lifestyle is a primary determinant of diet-related disease, what they will rationally do is decrease their belief in the link between Coke and diet-related diseases. So people will think maybe soda doesn't matter that much to dietary disease because the main thing that's important is exercise. So what this model does is demonstrate why this kind of curation strategy, sharing this distracting cause of a potential harm, can be so worrying. By sharing real scientific data about a real cause of a real world harm, industry can mislead even rational learners to make them think that their product is safer than it actually is. So another thing that we model, which is a bit related, is what we call sharing distracting effects. So for example, maybe you've heard that windmills kill birds. If you've heard about that, you've probably been a target of an influence campaign, which has been promoting information about the harms of windmills. They harm birds. They may not provide enough energy to the power grid. Maybe they harm whales and other cetaceans. What is happening here is, again, a kind of causal distraction where people tend to have beliefs that look like this. Okay, there's a cause, windmills, which usually creates this outcome, a reduction in fossil fuel use that people think of as a good thing. But oil and gas are spreading information about another effect of building windmills, which is bird death. And this is a real effect. It's something supported by actual scientists, and it's something that people generally think of as a negative. Now, in a case like this, what they're doing is, again, sharing real science with the goal of getting people to reweigh how much they think windmills are a good or a bad thing. So basically, we have this kind of real but distracting negative effect where the aim is to get people to decide against policies that industry doesn't like. Now, the last thing we model in this case are what we call distracting mitigants. So this again works slightly differently from either of the cases we've talked about, but it's most similar to the first thing. So there's a harm from industry. So let's consider the case of plastic production. That's an industry action causing plastic waste in oceans. And what we see industry doing is introducing a distracting mitigant, something that will prevent their cause from leading to a bad outcome. In this case, that mitigant is recycling. So we know recycling doesn't actually work that well in the case of plastic, but industry can draw a lot of attention to the potential for recycling to work. And as long as the public thinks it will work, that's distracting from the focal harm. So once again, we can model this with this kind of causal diagram, where here the industry harm is the production of plastic waste that leads to ocean pollution, and the mitigant is recycling. So if we thought that this causal pathway was a worry, that plastic waste was causing ocean pollution, but then we learn a lot about recycling, we may now think that in fact, that isn't such a worry, that this causal pathway is blocked by this mitigating effect. And the last thing we model combines some aspects of this technique to show that combining various sorts of distractions can be even more effective than using them on their own. So let's return to smoking as an example. Suppose you think the world works like this: smoking causes lung cancer. And that is what people were starting to realize in the 1950s and 60s. What we saw the tobacco industry introducing was both distractions and mitigants. So mitigants would include claims like cigarette filters will prevent the harms of smoking. And distractions would be alternative causes like, well, asbestos is causing lung cancer. And so what we show with our models is that if you start with a rational agent who thinks smoking is causing lung cancer, but then they learn a lot about cigarette filters, well, that decreases their belief that smoking could cause lung cancer. And then when they learn a lot of information about an alternative cause of lung cancer, that can reduce their belief even further. So again, what we're seeing here is a curation of what scientific data the public sees. And through that curation, industry getting targets to ignore a real harm. Now, notice that this kind of industrial distraction is itself a sort of cherry picking, but a different sort of cherry picking, where what propagandists are doing is choosing to emphasize just some parts of a causal truth rather than others. Before, when we were talking about cherry picking, we were talking about sharing just some pieces of evidence rather than others. Here, we're sharing a lot of evidence in some realm, but we're not sharing evidence about all the relevant causal realms to decision making and understanding. And I'll mention one more thing about industrial distraction, which is that in these cases, we often see industry funding some areas of science and not others, as well as sharing some information, but not others. So they're both contributing to the production of information, say about the link between asbestos and lung cancer, or contributing to information about the link between windmills and bird death. And then they're also sharing that information. So both funding and sharing work in this case. And I'll note that this funding idea relates to this work called experimentation by industrial selection by our co-author Justin Bruner and philosopher Bennett Holman, who focus on the way that selective industry funding can mislead the public. All right, so that's all the examples I'm going to talk about. What should we take away from all of this? So, one of the main arguments we want to make is about policy and information policy. So, the argument here is that curation, the shaping of real, accurate, but incomplete information, can be just as potent a form of misinformation as lying or fraud. Furthermore, curation often flies under the regulatory radar. So, if you look at science journalism, at science funding, at science sharing, there's much less worry about people curating information than there is about people lying or trying to influence scientists to create fraud or creating actively inaccurate information to share. So historically, we see industry using these kinds of curatory misinformation techniques in cases where they're already being looked at and monitored, where people are already saying, okay, enough with the lying about this topic. And instead, what they're doing is saying, I'm not lying, I'm just sharing real scientific data. So there's a question here. How do you regulate that? How do you create policy that prevents curation being used as a misinformation strategy? So I'm going to talk quickly about a few areas of policy and thinking that we think should be informed by the work I've presented here. And the first has to do with how we define misinformation for the purposes of regulation. So as I noted in the beginning, a lot of people have defined it as false or inaccurate content. But considerations like the ones I presented today and other kinds of work push towards broader understandings of misinformation that have to include things like accurate content that's cherry-picked or curated or shared in misleading ways. So what I think is the right conception is a flexible, inclusive conception of misinformation where it can include many, many different kinds of content, stuff that's false, stuff that's inaccurate, stuff that's true, stuff that doesn't even have a truth or falsity to it. But our conception should be oriented towards action. We should be asking what kinds of content, accurate or not, prevents people from acting in their own interests. And content that does that, we should be thinking about as misinformation. Now, how we understand misinformation, of course, shapes how we regulate it. So in a number of the cases I presented, having a better, broader sense of the impacts of curation should point us toward policy changes. So one thing that we've argued for is that industry contact with science in general should be limited as much as possible, and industry sharing of information more carefully scrutinized. The reason being is that we've seen all these examples where information can use these subtle curation techniques to shape public belief, to shape the progress of policy. And if they can do that using accurate information, and in cases where we're trying to regulate lying or fraud, we need to think of broader regulations that are really cutting off that industry influence on science and on public belief. When we talk about journalistic norms around context, and to some degree, these already exist, that you should give appropriate context to understand events, are very important. And also, we advocate for norms against reporting single events and studies that can potentially be misleading. So if when we report extreme events, we give them a broader context. What do most events look like? If when we report a scientific study, we report it in the context of what all the studies on that topic are showing us, we have less worries about these distortions from curation. And in general, we argue curation needs more attention. So both Jim and I have been part of policy discussions, white papers, work done for groups like the EU, attempting to limit the harms of misinformation. And in those discussions, we need to talk more about curation besides just talking about lying or misinforming content. And the last thing I'll just drop out there, I haven't talked too much about social media in this talk, but some of the most important curators in the modern world are social media algorithms. And when we look at internet regulation in particular, it's often very focused on suppressing or limiting disinformation and especially false and inaccurate content. So we think that conversations about these algorithms need to focus just as much on how they shape real data, events, and the information reaching users. And there has been some discussion of this. So, for example, tools like red feed, blue feed looked at the way algorithms are completely shaping the content people see online so that people who are left and right see entirely different worlds. So we think more focus on that kind of effect is necessary. And with that, I will say thank you.
Thank you so much, Cailin. This was wonderful. So I would like to open up our Q&A at this point for anybody who would like to ask Cailin questions about her wonderful presentation. You should be able to just pop those into the Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen. And just to kick us off, Cailin, if I may. So on the one hand, it seems like this is our susceptibility to misinformation is an anthropological constant, right? So we're hardwired to be attracted to novelty, to surprise. On the other hand, I'm wondering whether in the course of your research, and I don't know the extent to which you've looked at transnational or transcultural aspects of this, but one thing I'm thinking of is for example, levels of social trust serve to, in a sense, inoculate us from misinformation. So if you think about places like Scandinavia, where there are high levels of trust in your neighbor, in your fellow citizen, in government to do the right thing, to make reasonable decisions. Would there be a correlation between those kind of levels of social trust, or might there be other social factors that can serve to as a bulwark against misinformation?
So I'm not quite sure if there's like a clear answer about whether the level of trust in a country shapes like that country's whole response to misinformation. But one important thing to note here is that trust is in some way a two-edged sword. So you want to prevent the spread of misinformation, you want to trust the right sources, but you don't want to trust the wrong sources. And so, in fact, what you want is people who are well tuned to what kind of sources are trustworthy, rather than people who have either a lot of social trust or very little social trust.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. So our first question here, do you think misinformation and its spread is at all dependent on culture? So just kind of tying into what we just said, does the US need to change how it consumes and challenges information?
Good. And I think these are kind of different things. So certainly different things about a culture can impact misinformation spread. But I think what we're seeing, especially over, the last decade, is that a lot of the things that matter most are the information architectures and environments that people end up in. So, for example, regardless of your culture, when you have a new information architecture like social media, everyone is a new target of various kinds of misinformation. And we see these kinds of epistemic learning dysfunctions arising across many, many different cultures. Does the US need to change how it consumes and challenges information? I think yes, but my 2 cents is the most important changes are ones that are going to happen on the policy, infrastructure, and regulation level. So I think the US needs to do more the way some groups like the EU have done to think about how we protect social media users from disinformation. And probably we need to do more to think about protecting day-to-day people from distortive traditional media. So the US used to do more along those lines, and we used to have traditional media sources that were just much more accurate and much less partisan. So the Walter Cronkite days meant that we were all getting better information, better, like more true news and accurate news and contextualized news than we get in the era of Fox News and other hyper-partisan news sources.
Great. So the next question is specifically about methods. How do you develop the test models and ensure the results reflect real scenarios?
Good. So what we do with these kind of model, they're highly simplified models. There are certainly ways that they could go wrong or that they could, sort of fail to give us the right picture of how things work. Um, Usually we use them to kind of test different causal pathways for false beliefs, see if those are plausible, and then we discuss those results in the context of other empirical work, studies that psychologists do, stuff we're seeing actually happening in the real world with the spread of information, and basically use them to try to make good, well-grounded arguments. So, for example, our model about cherry picking industrial information. It's a simple model. There's ways in which it doesn't match the world, but it reveals a kind of logic that's very basic and that seems to fit very well with what we see industrial actors actually doing. And once that logic is revealed, it seems pretty clear that it would not be so hard to engage in this kind of misinformation. And so that's the sort of way we use these models in thinking about these topics.
Okay, and then we've got a question about counter curation. So, given that we know bad actors are engaging in a sort of malicious curation, what do you think of the tactic of counter curation to specifically shape an opposite message? For example, trying to reach people resistant to climate change belief by tying some of the more serious climate change implications to things they may already believe or care about.
Yeah, so I certainly think some kinds of counter curation can be successful. And you see, if you look historically, there have been a lot of cases of governments engaging in like counter curation campaigns to protect public health. So, for example, campaigns pointing out how harmful cigarette smoking is. And those have been effective. They, worked slower than they probably would have worked if tobacco wasn't on the other side, trying to get people to think tobacco was safe. Um, One place where this can be very tricky are in cases where people hold beliefs that are already polarized. So often the kinds of places we would want these counter curation campaigns are over things like climate change. And those are beliefs that are highly attached to social identity, where people have dug in their heels, and where holding them carries these social benefits and detriments, right? Like if I'm among a group of climate change believers, to say I'm a denier is going to have all these social consequences for me. In those kinds of cases, just having a counter curation campaign isn't really enough because there are all of these important social factors that hold beliefs in spread, or sorry, that hold beliefs in place that aren't just about is good information reaching people.
Great. Okay, and then with regard to information sources, any thoughts about sources as being indicative of trustworthiness? For example, how do we know when we shouldn't trust a .gov site?
Good. This is just an extremely difficult question. And part of the reason it's so difficult is that it's people who want to mislead are very much incentivized to produce information that looks real. So one example is there's this group, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that meets periodically, and they produce a report which says like what's the status of climate change, and it's usually kind of dire. Another group formed called I believe it's the non-governmental Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it's the IPCC and the NIPCC, and they produce a report that looks identical to the real one, but is a climate change denialist report. So how can any person look at these two and know what is going on, right? Um, there are some things you can do, though. There are a number of trusted sources, and here I'm thinking about like mainstream news sources that have been around a long time, that in general, it's not that they get everything perfect, but they're going to be pretty trustworthy. And what you want to be thinking about are what are places that have a reputation to uphold, where their incentive is to maintain a reputation of accuracy, truth telling, and seriousness. And so those kinds of news sources are generally going to be good ones to depend on. Generally, governmental reports will be fairly dependable too. I won't say that for every government, but the US, they'll be fairly dependable. And so those usually are the kind of sources that you can trust.
Perfect. Okay, getting into politics now. Have you found any direct explanations for why only certain sides of the ideological spectrum are more prone to believing conspiracy theories? Is there a link between certain kinds of belief systems and being more vulnerable to conspiracy theories and or misinformation?
Yeah, so it is widely established across a lot of studies that more right-wing beliefs are associated with more belief in conspiracy theories, more belief in other kinds of false claims and fake news in general. And it's not entirely clear why. So there are other things that make people more prone to trust like false information. For example, like age and certain kinds of personality characteristics do that. And in those cases, it's a little easier to see what the link is. Um, in this case, it's harder to untangle what's going on. One thing that I suspect, but I cannot say is like clearly the truth, is that there are a number of hyper-partisan news sources where the right-wing versions of them do tend to just report a lot of things that are false. Fox News being like the most obvious case. And so I think that if you are trusting a hyper-partisan news source and the one you're trusting just reports a lot of false things, you're going to be led into believing more false things. And so I think that's one kind of relevant cause there. It's a little hard to know what's going on.
Great. Okay, and then two questions, kind of like the question. So, what can we do? So, have you looked at methods for debunking misinformation and then how to comment effectively on social media in response to a vocal mainstream science denier, such as climate change? Or is it even worth the effort?
Yeah, good. So debunking is a literature that's kind of up in the air and controversial, and it's a little bit unclear how well it works or doesn't work. So there's been some evidence that like actually debunking can be quite successful, and things like, research teams that have people play games where they try to be an influencer online and then they come to understand better how these influence techniques work, have been shown to reduce people's susceptibility to false news. Or another team just came up with like an AI chat bot specifically designed to debunk things like conspiracy theories that they showed was fairly effective. And then there's some other studies showing that, especially with highly polarized beliefs, debunking doesn't work that well, that like these beliefs are quite entrenched. So I would say it's a little unclear what's going on. What I think is generally the case is that there's a lot of beliefs that are easy to debunk. So if you find out today a hurricane is coming towards you, and then tomorrow someone like, oh, there was a faulty like radar, that hurricane was never coming, you're going to just drop that belief in a second, right? Debunking is easy. You just give counter information and people drop the belief. The kinds of beliefs that are hard to debunk are, again, these ones that get tied up with identity, with politics, with your friend group. Vaccine effectiveness, climate change, evolutionary theory, because they take on all this other importance in people's social lives. And in those cases, debunking might not be as effective. This thing about commenting in response to like vocal science deniers is a very tricky one also, because there is evidence sometimes that like fighting about these kinds of topics, especially online where you're not face to face with someone, makes people entrench further into their positions. People don't like to be attacked, and they especially don't like to be attacked in ways that make them kind of ashamed in front of like another group of people. Techniques that seem to be more effective are ones that like draw a bridge of trust between you and another person. Face to face is more effective, but also things that are understanding, like I understand that you're hesitant about vaccines. I'm a mom too. I was really worried to give my kids the COVID vaccine because it was new. Here's why I decided to do it. That kind of trust building seems to be more effective than like head to head arguing it out.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cailin. We've actually gotten more questions that we're at a minute after time here. We've gotten more questions than we have time to pose to Cailin. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you so much, Professor O'Connor, for this wonderful talk today.
Yeah.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.